Today we're making a bib for a happy baby carrier. This one fits the original, also called the OG, and it fits carriers that were both pre and post the spring 2022 revision. We have 3 pieces here. We have the front, which has this curve up. This is the back. It's the part that goes between the baby and the baby carrier, and you have the option to have it long, which would you be cutting here, or you can do a short version. The short version gets you really close to the hood access pocket, but not quite there. So if you want to be able to access your hood, you can use the short version, and just know when you have the hood up that you're going to have the bib a little bit scrunched, or you can use the long version with this optional hood access slit, which I'll show you how to make. And over here we have the facing for the hood access, and you do not have to do this optional part, but I am going to show you how to do it if you want. So the first thing we're going to do is get these pattern pieces just cut a little bit smaller. I have a rotary cutting blade that is super dull, and I use it when I'm cutting paper. It used to be a fabric one, but now it's for paper. And I like to cut these down just a little bit smaller to help me be able to figure out where they fit on my fabric even better. This rotary cutter is starting to get almost too dull for paper. That's impressive. So I should have done this before cutting them out, but we do need to check our scale square. If you printed this 100%, the scale square will match perfectly. If you're having any problems after printing it 100% or no scaling, it's probably because you're not using Adobe Acrobat Reader and you're using like whatever your phone wants you to use to open it. That does cause problems sometimes, so make sure to download Adobe Acrobat Reader and it will print out just fine. So we have a marking on both of these patterns that you may not be familiar with, which is this arrow pointing at a line. This is the place on fold mark, or the cut on fold, however you wish to say it. It all means the same thing, even though the words are different, which means our fabric will be folded, and the vertical fold in our fabric is going to go right along this line. So in the end, we will cut a much wider piece. It does mean that it's important to make sure that you get the fabric right on that fold. Otherwise, you can end up with your pattern being too big or too small. If this makes you uncomfortable, there is nothing wrong with grabbing some more paper, a bigger sheet obviously, and just putting both sides here, making your pattern full size. Some people like that better. I also have a whole video on how to cut on the fold if this wasn't quite enough information for you. So I like folding these back along here. It helps make sure that I don't accidentally cut any of that off, because I need every bit of it when sewing. Next up, our fabric. I am using these beautiful prints from Rifle Paper Company. They just really work with the Bayou color of my carrier. Yeah, those blues they look so good together. So I'm going to fold my fabric, because I have a fold in my pattern. And then I'm going to check to see the width. So I have a lot over here, and if I choose to fold right here, I'm going to have like these weird pieces left over in the end. So I'm going to scooch this way and kind of grab here with my hand and slide this over. I find it a lot easier to just pick it up and shake it. That helps it find the straight of grain pretty easily. And I'm going to grab my other piece. Yikes, I probably should have measured this one first. It's bigger. Okay, I totally could have just cut the one and then refolded it for the other. There's nothing wrong with that. I want to be able to cut them at the same time. I use a rotary cutter very often to cut things out, but because I have so much hanging off of this right now, it's going to add a lot of weight that I'm trying to hold up. So I am just going to chop off the extra And the extra is not really big enough for me to use for anything. And it makes it so now all I have is this piece to work on cutting precisely. Anywhere that is a straight line, I like to use my rotary cutter. There are definitely a lot of curves in this pattern, but I am still using my rotary cutter and ruler to do as much of the straights as I can. That's just my preference. Do what works for you. And now I'm just kind of freewheel it. These corners can be a little tricky. Use scissors to get to them if you need to, or cut the whole thing out with scissors. You know, I won't judge you. So there's a couple things we need to mark. I need to mark my snaps, or I can just do that at the end. But theoretically, you should, do those now. I need to mark this dot here because we need to stop sewing this top edge at the dot. My personal preference is to just cut a slit in my seam allowance that aims at the dot. That's good enough for me, but you can mark the actual dot if it works better for you. You do need to make sure you don't go past the seam allowance. I almost did there, because we want that seam allowance intact to be able to sew through it. And lastly, we have this optional hood slit. This is one of the easiest ways. Cutting down the center and then diagonally into either corner. So all you need to do is mark the center line and the end line. And now I'm going to use my ruler to connect this all. And I also know that the slit is 9 inches long, so I can line my 9-inch up here, or my 4.5 inch up on that center fold. That's probably even a better option. There is so many different ways to mark a line, like a pocket mark or anything else on a pattern. This is just one, and this line does not need to be perfect. You just want it vaguely straight and level. You can check it from the bottom if you're not sure that you got it level. Or you can use one of those rolly wheels with chalk in between those layers. Also a great option. So we have one layer, our dark layer. We can call it our fashion fabric or our lining. It's reversible, so it doesn't really matter. We have these done. And now we're gonna get the light colored layer done. And then we will check out our fabric and try to find 2 kind of weird spots that we can use to get this piece out of. Because I'd rather use scrap as much as possible to get that piece.
Welcome to the Audio Renaissance Unabridged presentation of Full Tilt. Written by Janet Ivanovich and Charlotte Hughes.
So now that the interfacing is on, we need to make our marks for the pocket slit. So I'm going to fold it in half so that I can get a good mark of the center. And we're just marking it by folding. And then I'm going to fold it the other way as well. It is really hot though. Yikes. Okay, we can see the crosshatch there really well in person. I'm not sure it shows up at all for the camera, but we're still gonna do the same thing over here. Okay, let's see if this will show up on camera. Kinda. Let's offset it with some color so you can more easily see it. Okay, so I have ironed the center mark and the horizontal mark, and now I need to create the center line and that center line. And we need to make sure we also have end points. So a vertical here. That's what I like doing because I'm going to put my presser foot along these lines. And then I'm going to sew on the end line and then put my presser foot edge on the center line. You're going to be sewing this square here. So if it's easier for you to mark a square, go ahead and do that. It's easier for me to mark a straight line with ends. There's our center line. Here's our middle line. You certainly would not need to make them this dark. I'm hoping they show up by me making them this dark. And then the line is 9 inches long, which means 4.5 is going to go on the center. There we go. So I draw my line along the end, and then Use the other side of my ruler, line this up with 9, and there we go. That's what I need. Now I repeat it on the other side. 2 facing pieces ready to be used. Now on most patterns you would need to finish the edge of these pieces, but they're actually going to be hidden inside, so there's no need to. The last thing that we need to cut is absorbent material. That is what actually is going to hold all that drool and spit, and it will be one of these on the fold and one of these on the fold. If you're going to be using the pattern that has the slit here, the absorbent material needs to be out of the way. So I find it easier to just do it now. And it needs to be well out of the way. This is like the minimal amount to cut out. I think I will probably end up cutting even more. We want to make sure that the absorbent material does not interfere with that slit. The first sewing step has to do with the hood access slit. If you're not doing this, just skip past this, and I will put a time on the screen that you can skip to. You're going to be doing this to both the inside and the outside, so both layers here. So the facing and your back piece are going to go right sides together, and then you are going to align this line here with the line underneath. So I'm just going to put my pin right at the intersection and then right at the intersection. So those are going to be right on top of each other, and I'm going to do that just to hold it still. Let's do the same thing on the other end. The pin is right at the intersection. The pin is right at the intersection. Make sure it drops down straight, and then I'm pinning to hold still. So I'm not going to rely on just those 2 pins to hold everything still. Despite how little I like pinning, this is like pin the crap out of it time. So now our goal is going to be to sew with the edge of our presser foot along this line. So these are our ends, this is our center, and we are going to sew a box. The ends are going to... I forgot to start recording, so we have just a little bit done that I'm going to sew right over the top of so you can see what I'm doing. The edge of the presser foot is going to line up right in here, and then we are going to sew down to there. I'm going to set my machine to stop with its needle down to make my life a little bit easier here. There we go. My machine has the ability to change its up and down needle by just tapping the presser foot, so that's why you may have heard the tapping. Now I have turned, and I'm going to drop my stitch length down to like 1.5. This is not like 100% necessary. It just makes these end stitches a little tinier and stronger because we're going to have to get really close to them. I am now going to pivot and check to see if I've gone far enough, and I have. And that's just from years of sewing. I'm going to do a couple more shorts, and then I'm going to go back to my standard length and head on down this other side. If at all possible, you do not want to sew across pins. Okay, we're getting to our line again. Awesome. It's a little bit far. It's okay. Turn here. Everything's smooth and lined up. I'm going to drop that stitch length down short again. Go on my end. I'm going to need to have needle down in order to pivot. And I obviously went a tad far, but it's not far enough to care about in my mind. It's close enough. I'm going to put my needle back to its standard length, my stitch. And there we go. And then I'm going to tie off. Now that I have these sewn, it's time to cut it out. I prefer to start with a rotary cutter. Nothing wrong with scissors though, but you don't want to get too close to those ends. On those ends, you are going to clip into the corner, both sides. Be careful not to cut through that stitch line. Same thing on the other side. Now this part, I like to do a little finger pressing just because it looks prettier once you get it turned, but you're gonna press this on the iron anyway. So this is gonna come through here to the back. All of these edges are gonna be pulled through. And yeah, it's a little bit crazy. It wiggles a bunch when you're getting it set. So I suggest grabbing some clips or some pins just to help you get everything to hold still while you're getting it to turn. If I flip this over, you can see it's now a beautiful finished slit. Give it a press and then sew around it. And this is going to be where you access the hood. But we're going to have 2 layers here, and that's why we cut out the opening in our absorbent material. So once you get one done, make sure you get it pressed, then you do the other one. We have both the inside and outside done, and the next natural step is to top stitch. I think that's a good idea, but I also want to tell you that you are going to be top stitching these 2 pieces together again later. So we're going to be top stitching the holes individually, which will just keep everything laying nice and smooth. But later on in the process, I'm going to just show you it now. Later on, this will be here. This will be here. And we'll get all that absorbent material out of the way, but then you're going to be top stitching these 2 layers together again through this opening. So just keep that in mind when you're top stitching now. Either you need to top stitch now very close to the edge and then duplicate that later, or you need to give yourself a nice wide top stitch now, so that when you do these 2 edges together, it can look like a beautiful 2 lines of stitching that mirror each other. Of course, you can just choose to not top stitch now, and then you will only have 1 line of stitching later. Or you can do hand stitching later, where you just kind of put these 2 edges near each other and then whip stitch them together by hand, which is also a wonderful look. So these, top stitching around the opening or being a daredevil and leaving it. This, I'm just gonna do it now. I'm gonna make this wider open. And it can be quite a bit wide. It's okay. It's not gonna cause you any problems to have this wider. This is not an area of the bib that your child is going to actively chew or suck on, so it's not really necessary to have the absorbent material down this far. This top edge is really where it needs to be. So our next process is to make the layers. Remember this circle here that I chose to cut a slit towards, so aim's right there. This is a good time to drop a pin in that, or a weird looking pin, or even mark it to help you remember that those are there. We're going to put our other piece right on top that also has those markings and line those right up with the markings from the other layer. Add as many pins to the center section as you need to make yourself comfortable. We will be sewing from this pin across the top curve to this pin. This is the only part being sewn on this piece. And then we repeat the same thing on the other parts. So our light colored one and even our absorbent fabric. We are going to sew each of these layers along the top curve from pin to pin. Remember, the seam allowance in this pattern is 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter. So you'll need to check on your throat plate where that is, or use some type of seam guide. This foot is actually a centimeter wide, or 3/8 of an inch wide. So I just pick a foot, that's what I need. I've lined my sewing machine up with our starting point. I'm going to pull out our pin, and then I'm going to do some tacking stitches. There we go. And now I'm off to the races. I'm going to get right up to my end point just before my pin. I'm going to pull my pin out. And now I'm going to do my tacking stitches. And we're ready to start the next one. Our pieces have all been sewn together on the top here. Now we need to do a little work before we layer them. First, our absorbent material is really bulky. So from those notches inward, you are going to cut down the absorbent material to basically the stitch line. And every time you sew the absorbent material, you're going to do the same thing. So throughout this process, just kind of get used to this step. It's just such a bulky material that if we leave it in the seam line, it's going to make our project not look very nice. So here's our absorbent layer. Now for our two fabric layers, we have to look at the curve. So the curve goes outward, which means we need to take notches out of it, so that when it flips the other way, it lays smoothly. Be careful not to cut through your stitch line. Now that these pieces are prepared, it's time to layer them up. I like to start with my absorbent layer on the bottom, and then we are going to open it up the best that we can. Next, we're going to pick one of our other layers and put it face up. And then the other layer is going to go face down so that our fabrics are right sides together. So now that we have it layered in the proper order, there is a lot of aligning and pinning that has to be done so that when you sew around all of these edges, that everything is lined up right and doesn't wiggle out of the way. So use as many pins and clips as you want to be able to help you. So if you do have a slit in your project, you can forgo the turning hole because you'll be able to turn everything through the slit. If you do not have a slit, you will need to leave an opening down here for turning through. So go around and line up everything. I like to attack the corners first. They're pretty much the easiest thing to know that you're getting lined up, and don't feel like you have to go around it in a particular order. Jump around, picking the next thing that makes sense to you. When it comes to these inside corners, we are going to be sewing up to this clipping point on both sides. So you can choose to open up both of your seams, top and bottom, so that you can sew over a nice smooth seam, or you can just sew to this seam and then on the other side also sew to that seam. Please remember also that absorbent material like batting or Zorb has a tendency to grow, and it's also really hard to cut it exact because of the loft. So you need to pay attention to your fabric pieces, and you're going to be sewing along them and just kind of ignoring the absorbent material if it's sticking out over the edge or what have you. Just pay attention to the fabric bits. I'm gonna put on my story.
Jamie was tempted to die from her high heels and end it all right there. How much did you hear? Something about a guy named Philip.
Okay, everything is pinned together. So now we're just gonna sew around the edges. We need to go all the way up into here, and I have laid the seam allowances of both layers flat here so it makes a nice clean corner. And we do need to make sure to catch some of the stitches here, otherwise we'll have a hole in the corner. There are a lot of corners here. Make sure you put your needle down, lift your presser foot up, and pivot to get around all the corners. If you're having trouble pivoting the corners, you can always sew off a corner and then start again heading the new way. Sometimes that's the easiest way to get nice points. Remembering you're following the edge of your fabric, not your absorbent material. It's going to shift, it's going to get bigger, it's going to change size just because of the nature of absorbent material. It is not very stable. So make sure you're following the edge of your fabric and just trying to make sure you're catching the absorbent material and putting it vaguely where it should go. But if it is too big or too small, just focus on your fabric. I'm laying everything as flat as possible when I go into these corners. I want to make sure things are smooth and I'm not catching anything. At this point, I'm lifting up my presser foot and I'm even smoothing that seam allowance down under the presser foot so everything gets caught. And I'm stopping with my needle right on that seam line there. Today I'm sewing on my Eversewn Sparrow QE, and it has some wonderful features, like what I'm going to do right here. I can use my foot pedal to change my needle up and needle down, super fun. And then I have programmed my reverse button here to automatically tack and cut. So I'm good to go. All of our layers are sewn together. I do not have an opening here because I'm going to be turning through my pocket slit. If you do not have a pocket slit though, you definitely need to leave an opening here. But don't panic about it at this moment. Just leave your stitches in if you didn't leave an opening, and we'll open it up right before we need it. So remember how I said you're gonna have to get used to trimming away that absorbent material? Well, it's time. We're going to trim away all the absorbent material up to basically the stitch line from all of these edges. Now you can certainly use regular scissors. I think smaller scissors do better for this. And I have these crazy scissors, which I love, which are duckbill applique scissors. And they just really help me be able to slide under here and get them. You can also use them where the larger part is sliding under, which I think is technically how you're supposed to use them, but either way, I think it works really well. You certainly don't have to use crazy scissors, but they are ones that I love. So now we're going to trim around and get rid of all of this extra absorbent material. Now when it comes to these corners, you can cut across them diagonally if you'd like, and then kind of trim around our stitch lines, because when you are not doing a pivot in your stitch lines, cutting away the absorbent material is a little bit messier, but it doesn't affect your outcome, so don't worry about it. Our next step after this will be cutting the corners and clipping stuff on our fabric side, so don't worry about that yet. Just worry about the absorbent material.
Jamie laughed out loud. You know, I wouldn't want to pay your grocery bill. I'll bet it takes a lot to feed your ego.
Okay, we have all the absorbent material cut out. And now it's time to deal with the actual fabric. We need to clip our corners to reduce bulk. And the curves that are going on here, we need to do a couple of clips in here. And this could probably use like a notch. But just go around the outside edges and do all of that clipping, notching, and trimming. That's appropriate. You may find it easier to do it from this side so that visually you're not distracted by the absorbent material. Do not cut your fingers off either. Yeah, just tried that one. Looks like everything is smooth. All the corners have been cut, so everything should turn rather easily. And now we have this lovely slit here that's going to help us do it. Now you will want to go around all the edges and use whatever corner turning device you prefer to help get all the edges smooth. A pencil is a great option. So you can just go in here and help smooth all of those corners. Sometimes I will also use a seam ripper from the outside to help pull out those points. Chopstick, also a great tool. Oops. Pencil down. If I use this end, I'm going to stab myself, right? Let's see what I have better. Rounded edge of scissors can also work. Again, careful, please. Yes, I know may make tools exactly to do this. Where is mine? No earthly idea. It could be inches from me. I mean, it likely is, but I haven't seen it in a while. Okay. Now, theoretically, before you turned this, you probably should have checked these points right in here. This is the spot where you're gonna get a hole if you're gonna get one. I have not ended up with a hole, which is quite frankly amazing, because I always kind of cut this corner too close. If you have a hole here, you can certainly turn everything the other way and re-sew it, but quite frankly, I prefer to just take a couple of hand stitches there. It's a weird spot, so now it's time to get everything ready for our top stitching. We're going to be top stitching around all the edges, but also the slit opening here. I'm not going to pin the slit opening yet because I'm going to take this to the ironing board and give everything a good press so it's easier to top stitch. And now we gotta wait for the iron to warm up. I have a senior citizens iron, so my iron shuts itself off regularly. I know there are people who find that extra super annoying to have your iron shut off, but I actually like the safety of it. I would rather wait for my iron to heat up any day than I would rather forget my iron is on and then come back a day later to find it on. It's terrifying to me. So I am happy with my iron shutting off after a certain number of minutes, and it also shuts off if it falls over. So if it's in a weird position, including down on your fabric, for more than a certain number of minutes, it just shuts off. So that means if it gets tipped over for any reason, whether it be a child bumped the ironing board to an earthquake, it just shuts itself off after a few minutes. It may manage to lightly burn something in that time, but not very much. Okay, we got all that. Now we need to actually be prepared to top stitch. So if you're not happy with any of the way your ironing around the edge went, pin around it to help it stay the way you want it. Go back and iron it. But we need to work on this center hole, the slit. It's pretty unlikely that your slit is in fact exactly the same size top and bottom. It's just the nature of fabric. The turn of the cloth, cutting, everything, it's not going to be the same. It just isn't. But it's probably going to be rather close. And I really want to feel with my hands that it's laying smooth here and all the way over to this other side. Use pins to do that if it's helpful. So a line of basting on your machine if you really need to make sure it's laying perfectly flat. If you're not feeling comfortable with where your hands are putting it, use the tools that you have to do what you need to do. So those edges are coming up close enough for me. They are super, super close. So my options here are going to be to top stitch very close to the edge, which would be edge stitching, or I can hand stitch these two edges around here, like with a whip stitch or a ladder stitch. With that, you could even use some type of iron-on interfacing or glue to hold these edges together while you're sewing as well. So because we're top stitching a light color and a dark color together, you either need to pick a color of thread that's going to work for both, or you need to put a different thread in your top and bottom. I have already done top stitching here in different colors, so now I'm going to have to top stitch with a different top and bottom color. So I am going to start on the bottom near the tag because it's really easy to hide the overlap, and no customer complains about the overlap when it's right at your tag because they know you need to sew your tag in. So it makes perfect sense. So let's get this started. My needle is unthreaded. It's complaining at me and I'm like, oh, well, no big deal. Yeah, my needle seriously wasn't threaded. Yeah, you think you guys do stuff? I do stuff all the time. Don't be mad at yourself when things happen because they happen. Like, my sewing machine is literally trying to tell me something is wrong. And what I do is go, nah, I know what I'm doing. I don't know what I'm doing. Okay, when it comes to this corner, you're going to want to, like, really put things flat and smooth. And if you're like, wow, there is too much bulk in there, you still have this opening. You can literally just go in there and trim anything out that's in the way and not helping things be smooth. So what I'm doing occasionally is kind of flipping it and really working on getting that seam line straight sideways so that both the front and the back are even. Even though I pressed it, you can still manipulate that edge a little bit to help you get a super crisp look. And even though you're doing all this manipulating here and holding it, you still don't want to push or put your hand back and pull. The machine is doing all of the moving. I am holding the fabric where I want it and letting the machine move. I could let the machine go without barely touching it. So all I'm really doing is using my hands as pins. You could just put pins in place instead. Okay, our outside edge is done. Now we need to do this inside edge. I'm going to move my needle over because I want to just stab those edges. And I just did that by hand to make sure I knew where it was going to fall. This is really thick in here. And so my sewing machine thinks that my presser foot isn't down. That's the little complaint that you heard. Well, we have done all of the top stitching around both the outside edges and on the center here. I ended up hand stitching just these edges to really get them together, and then everything smoothly went together when I machine stitched it. So whatever works for you to get it to the way you want it is fine. The last part is some snaps. We have snaps that go here and here. If we look back on our patterns, wherever I put them, found them. If we look back on our patterns, we have 2 snap markings here, and we also have two snap markings here. Now, if you marked them ahead of time, your marks are already there. Perfect. If you forgot to, which happens all the time, it's fine. But what you need to be aware of is that you have sewn off the seam allowance, so you now need to align this, the edge, and you have to understand that there is a bit of turn of the cloth involved. So these marks are 1/2 inch from the seam line, which is in there. So if you're going to mark them now, you need to kind of hedge this over the edge just a touch to make sure your snaps end up in the right place. Here we got our Happy Baby carrier. This is a 2nd generation carrier, which means it was produced in spring 2020 or later. So the straps are a little bit narrower, and we have our hood pocket on the back. So just set it behind. Or obviously you can put it on when you're wearing the carrier as well. This goes around the corner, and these just snap in. There we go. We have the Happy Baby logo still showing, and the top edge of our carrier totally protected. Now let's go to the back and look at the hood slit. So here is the slit, and it fits just above that opening. So you can pop your hood out here. But here we go. So this allows the hood to just pop right out of this opening, and for you to have complete access to the pocket, and the bib still stays nice and smooth. This bib is reversible, so of course pick whatever color's your favorite that you made, or flip it around if one side gets stained, or make one side special occasion fabric, like make one side perfect for Halloween or Christmas, and make the other side something more all the time. Bibs are a great way to dress up your carrier for special occasions. Weddings, you can put like satin or silk bib on here, something that just kind of takes it up a notch, allows you to have fun and play with it, but also gives you that protection for your carrier all the time. I'm Alice the Fabric Ninja, and thank you for watching my tutorial. You can find this pattern on my website, fabricninja.com. Look in the shop section and go down to baby wearing patterns, and then patterns for the Happy Baby carrier. I have bibs, suck pads, and hoods for lots of different carrier brands.